Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn right now to Murtaza Hussain, a reporter at The Intercept, who, together with Glenn Greenwald, wrote the piece, The Khorasan Group, Anatomy of a Fake Terror Threat to Justify Bombing Syria. Murtaza, welcome to Democracy Now! Murtaza is joining us from Toronto. Can you talk about what you've learned about the so-called Khorasan Group?
So the Khorasan Group is a group which first came up in the media around September 13th, roughly a week or so before the U.S. bombing campaign of Syria began. Heretofore, no one had heard of this group. It was not known in intelligence circles or among people who follow Syria. And suddenly we saw in the media that this was being described as the major terrorist threat emanating from that country and a direct threat to the U.S. homeland, unlike ISIS. So this ended up being one of the main justifications for the war in Syria, or the military airstrikes which are conducted in Syria, and it became the major media narrative justifying that action.
And talk about, well, for example, where the Khorasan Group got its name.
So the Khorasan Group, the name itself does not denote any group within Syria that anyone has familiar with or has heard of before. It's a name that was developed within the U.S. government to describe a certain set of individuals within the group Jabhat al-Nusra, which is one of the opposition factions fighting the Syrian government. Jabhat al-Nusra is also believed to be a franchise of al-Qaeda within Syria, but unlike al-Qaeda proper, it's focused exclusively on fighting the government of Bashar Assad. So in order to justify these strikes against this group, the U.S. had to create a new name to designate these few individuals within that group that they're looking to target. So they developed this name, the Khorasan Group, which identified several fighters who they say planned to wage attacks against the United States, as opposed to the government of Bashar Assad, and they conducted the strikes under that justification. Now, within Syria, people view this group as being indistinguishable from the regular group of Jabhat al-Nusra, and it's being viewed as an attack on that group, which is why yesterday you saw a statement from that group's leader vowing revenge for the deaths of his commanders.
I want to turn to CNN's Pentagon reporter Barbara Starr talking about the Khorasan Group.
What we are hearing from a senior U.S. official is the reason they struck Khorasan right now is they had intelligence that the group of al-Qaeda veterans was in the stages of planning an attack against the U.S. homeland and/or an attack against a target in Europe. And the information indicated that Khorasan was well on its way, perhaps in the final stages of planning that attack.
That was Barbara Starr of CNN. Your response?
So in the days leading up to the attack, several anonymous sources suggested that an attack was imminent. They suggested that there were a threat against airliners using toothpaste bombs or flammable clothing. And they said that, like Barbara Starr mentioned, they're in the final stages of planning this attack. After the strikes were carried out, several U.S. officials started walking back that estimation quite far, and saying that the definition of imminence is unclear, and when we're saying is a strike about to happen, we're not sure what that means exactly. So in retrospect, this definition of a strike being imminent and this characterization of a threat coming from this group, which is very definable and very clear, became very unclear after the strikes. And they suggested through the New York Times the strikes were merely aspirational and there was no actual plot today existing against the United States. So the actual justification for the strikes was completely negated after the strikes ended, which was something quite troubling.
Well, explain what you mean, negated right after the strikes began, right after the justification worked.
Right. So after the strikes happened and there were statements saying that people were killed and the group had been scattered, James Comey and many others within the U.S. establishment started saying that, well, you know, we said the strikes were imminent from this group, but what does imminence really mean? It could be 6 months, could be a year. And other anonymous officials started saying there was not any threat at all. There was not any plan in the works to attack the United States. And then further it came to light that the Khorasan Group itself, which we've been hearing about in the media was a new enemy and was a definable threat against the United States, did not really exist per se. It was simply a group of people whom the U.S. designated within a Syrian opposition faction as being ready to be struck. So the entire narrative that developed and within the media developed was completely put to a lie after the strikes. And it was interesting that Ken Delaney reported the story first in the Associated Press, saying that this was a new threat and a new group. And he was one of the first people to break the story afterwards, saying that U.S. officials are now adding more nuance, is the word he used, to their previous warnings about the group. So it was kind of a really egregious case of media spin, whereby the media had taken out this narrative of a threat from a new terrorist group, and then after the strikes had been conducted, which justified this group, they immediately took the opposite tack, saying that in fact there was no threat that was imminent, and the group itself did not exist per se. So it was really quite a failure of the media, which we've seen several times in the past as well.
You mentioned Ken Delaney of AP. Now, Intercept just put out another story. The CIA's mop-up man, LA Times reporter, cleared stories with agency before publication. Ken Silverstein writes, a prominent national security reporter for the Los Angeles Times routinely submitted drafts and detailed summaries of his stories to CIA press handlers prior to publication, according to documents obtained by The Intercept. He goes on to say email exchanges between CIA public affairs officers and Ken Delaney, and now an Associated Press intelligence reporter who previously covered the CIA for The Times, show that Delaney enjoyed a closely collaborative relationship with the agency, explicitly promising positive news coverage and sometimes sending the press office entire story drafts for review prior to publication. In at least one instance, the CIA's reaction appears to have led to significant changes in the story that was eventually published in the Los Angeles Times. Your response to that piece?
Right. So essentially, the administration will seek out reporters who are pliant and willing to work with them to leak stories like this. So in the sense of those CIA stories, this reporter had his stories vetted. He promised favorable coverage in exchange for access. And again, here, the Khorasan Group story first came out with this reporter. And, the media's role is to ask questions and to vet these claims quite thoroughly. But instead, the claims are put out through reporters who were known to give favorable coverage and who were known to, take the administration's line in exchange for access. And it seems like this happened again in the sense that here was a reporter who put out the story. They did not vet who the Khorasan Group is, what the veracity of these claims are, but they put it out in the media and it became a media story on its own. So I think that you're seeing the same narrative replay as happened, as we detailed in the previous story as well.
I wanted to turn to another piece that you wrote, Murtaza, Why the Islamic State is Not Really Islamic, which refers to a letter that has been signed by many Muslims. Can you explain who's written this letter and who it was sent to?
So there was an open letter published to the leader of the Islamic State, Abu Bakr Baghdadi, from over 120 of the most prominent religious scholars among Muslim scholars in the world. And there was the Mufti of Egypt, Bosnia, Nigeria, and many other countries around the world, including the United States. And they published an open letter condemning point by point the practices of the so-called Islamic State. And it was done purely from a theological standpoint. And they had given very rigorous critique of the group and found it, by their standards, to be un-Islamic. Now, this goes back to the question of what is or is not Islamic. Islam is not a monolith. It's subject to interpretations of the people who take part in it. And, this group found them to be decidedly un-Islamic. I think most Muslims around the world would find them to be un-Islamic, despite their pretensions to the contrary. So the point I was making in the article is that when you identify them as being Islamic and you say that they are the definition of Islam, you're playing to their narrative. That's the legitimacy they want, and which today they don't have, and they're rejected broadly by Muslims around the world. So it's important to say that, well, they may partake in Islamic dialogue, and they may use the symbols of Islam. We cannot let any one group of extremists anywhere define a faith or a civilization which is identified with by over 1 billion people around the world.
Well, we'll link to your pieces at democracynow.org. I want to thank you for being with us. We've been talking to Murtaza Hussain, who is a reporter with The Intercept. His latest two pieces, The Khorasan Group, Anatomy of a Fake Terror Threat to Justify Bombing Syria, and Why the Islamic State is Not Really Islamic. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace